needs to stop. Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates addressed the ramifications of releasing classified information.
Any disclosure outside of authorized channels is a criminal offense, and we will simply not tolerate the illegal release of classified information.
On Wall Street, the Dow up to a new high, up 67 points. I'm Barton Eckert.
I'm Barry Ritholtz. You're listening to Masters in Business on Bloomberg Radio. My special guest today is Professor Richard Clarida. He is a global strategist for PIMCO, as well as a professor of international affairs at Columbia University. Let's talk a little bit about some of the private sector work you've done, because some of that stuff is really fascinating. You've consulted for the likes of J.P. Morgan, Credit Suisse, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. What does that work look like? What's that process like?
Well, it depends. I think in the case of Credit Suisse, that was almost 20 years ago, and I was essentially working with their FX team to build some econometric models of the currency market and currency valuation. So they were essentially outsourcing some of that to me. I was actually sort of proud. They were running that model for about 15 years or so. They've since retired it, but so that was a good project. You know, the New York Fed has a lot of programs. In the case of there, I visited during the summer, worked on some papers, co-authored with their staff, spent some time back in the 90s when Rick Mishkin was the director of research at the New York Fed, where he had a little kitchen cabinet of people who would come down every Friday and have lunch.
I love that idea of a kitchen cabinet around the New York Fed.
Yeah.
Is that still going on?
I believe so. I have not done it in a while, but it's quite an impressive group. You had Chris Sims, who's a Nobel laureate. Someone named Ben Bernanke was there every week. Rick Mishkin, Mike Woodford. So it was a real treat to be part of that group.
If you remember the book from the 60s, The Money Game, by Adam Smith was the nom de plume.
Oh, yes.
He describes a similar sort of kitchen cabinet that was run by Scarsdale Fats, and it was movers and shakers on Wall Street who would get together on a Friday afternoon and discuss what they were doing, what they were looking at, what they were seeing, and there was all sorts of conspiratorial overtones. Meanwhile, it was just six guys sitting around chewing the fat over what stocks they liked and didn't, and they had far less power than was it to them. But I like the idea of that taking place with the New York Fed. Speaking of the Fed, you did work with former Fed Chairman Paul Volcker.
I did, and it was one of the thrills of my professional career. So
do tell.
Paul Volcker,
better known as Tall Paul, or I should say also known as
Paul Volcker, for many years after he left Fed. I should say Paul Volcker is one of my heroes. You know, you talk about profiles and courage, but what Paul Volcker did under enormous pressure and with very high stakes to break the back of inflation in the early 1980s and really bequeath the foundations for a 25-year bull market in bonds and stocks.
He gets far less credit than he should.
Oh, my goodness.
He is really the prime architect.
He's truly
a 30-year bond bull market and the recovery in both the U.S. economy and the U.S. stock market.
Yeah, and all based upon basically making the right decisions in a 4 or 5 year period. So literally one of the giants of economics. But to answer your question, after he left the Fed, he spent many years at something called the Group of 30, which is basically an informal organization of former policymakers. And the Group of 30 commissioned a paper by me. I'm not a member of the Group of 30. I'm not in that club. But they occasionally commission papers. And so Paul and his team asked me to write a paper right after the Asia financial crisis on sort of what
98?
the 98, 99, what the global currency markets would look like in the aftermath of that crisis. And so I took it as an opportunity to write a long 60-page scholarly paper thinking about the foreign exchange markets after the Asia crisis. So it was a real treat to work with him.
That's quite fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about PIMCO.
Yeah.
You're a global strategist for them.
Yeah.
You're a managing partner in the New York
director.
office. Is that right?
That's right.
Tell us what that work is like.
So I've been with PIMCO for 11 years. It seems just like yesterday.
So you've been there through a lot of pre and post era and a lot of of interesting times.
Yeah. And so what do I do for PIMCO? Well, I basically work on global macro, focusing on the G10 economies. Given my interest and my research, I spend a lot of time thinking about the Fed and other central banks. Obviously, central banks are key to value bonds. PIMCO has a lot of clients, especially around the world, who I go see. And then more recently, since 2014, the folks there have asked me to oversee our annual Secular Forum process, which is really an integral part of PIMCO's investment process. We've been doing it for 36 years.
Wow.
We bring in outside speakers 3 days a year just for the investors and the executives of the firm to think about what the global economy is going to look like over the next 3 to 5 years. So you mentioned the new normal in one of the earlier segments. I talked about the new neutral. Those were both themes that emerged from our Secular Forum process. And so that's now essentially my role is to coordinate that effort.
That's fascinating. How do you integrate global monetary and global fiscal policy into ideas of either fixed income investing or any type of investing?
Yeah, well, and I think that's obviously that's crucial for me to add value to the operation. I think I'll give you a concrete example. This whole idea that we talked about it a moment ago about the new neutral, that is something that I began to think about based on my academic work, working with something that we would call a forward-looking version of a Taylor rule, work I did with Mark Gertler and Jordy Galley at NYU. So we were pretty early on in the late 90s and sort of focusing on a rules-based monetary policy. But one of the things about the original Taylor rules, it assumed that this neutral policy rate was constant. And I began to be persuaded that, in fact, we're in a world where neutral is not constant. In fact, it's going to be lower, the destination for the funds rate. And so I basically was making the case internally that we needed to factor this in. That became what we call our new neutral thesis, and it's been a really important part of the way that we've been investing for the last 3 years.
So let me get you to define this.
Yeah.
Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling.
Oh, my. Mouthful.
And that's pretty much the name of one of your papers.
Yeah, well, and that's the name of the branch of economics that I work in. That's an example where the jargon's probably relevant to other members of that club, but I think to the general public is probably not all that important. Essentially what it means is that you're building a model of the economy, which is going to be modeling the economy over time, so it's dynamic over time, but it also allows for stuff to happen.
Right.
Stuff happens, so shocks to happen. So you want to know how the economy evolves when it's hit by shocks, oil shocks, supply shocks, fiscal shocks. And so that's the stochastic part of the equation.
It's so in other words, it sounds much worse than it really is.
Exactly.
I previously had your PIMCO colleague Paul McCulley on. He's somebody I met fishing in Maine, of all places, and he's a big Hyman Minsky fan who is infamous for saying stability breeds instability. Yeah. Do you think that's true? And given this period of stability we've seen, are we potentially breeding more instability?
Well, first of all, since you mentioned Paul, just a note on Paul.
And I know he's teaching at Cornell these days.
Just to mention, one of the real high points of my time at PIMCO was a chance to work very closely with Paul for 6, 7, or 8 years, and I learned so much from him. And in particular, when I got there in 2006, he was already on the Minsky soapbox, and I must admit at that time I had some vague recollection of reading Minsky in graduate school, but obviously that was a very, very prescient call on his part. To your broader question, clearly in retrospect, and believe me, Barry, I did not have a crystal ball in 2005 and 2006, but clearly in retrospect, the stability of the 2000s did breed instability through, as we mentioned, the securitization and the credit derivatives and all of that stuff. So what I'd like to say is I think the old saying is, generals are good at fighting the last war. So I'm very convinced, Barry, that two things. There will be another financial crisis. And I'm convinced that the other thing is it will not look like the last crisis, because we're always quite good at making sure the next crisis looks different. And that's where I think the real power of Reinhardt and Rogoff is we keep persuading ourselves that things are different because we're not going to have another, subprime